Michael Hendrix. He is a creative director and associate partner at IDEO, and he's going to be talking about how designers use, here we go, visual and physical metaphors, right, to stimulate our five senses. We have five, right?
We do.
Okay. I'm going to pass it off, and I'm going to do the magic trick here where I switch the presentations while you tell somebody.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming this morning. I don't think I normally get up this early to be creative or talk about creativity. And so I have a lot of respect for all of you to be able to come here with smiles and bright eyes. And I'm sure the sunshine has something to do with that. So this morning I'm going to talk about this new body of work that I've come across in the last probably year and a half, called embodied cognition, and hopefully I'll tell you enough about it to introduce the idea. And then at the end I want to suggest some applications that you can try today when you go to work, or if you cut out and go do something else, that will help you, I hope, be more creative and accomplish what you want, and probably just as importantly, convince your clients that you actually know what you're talking about. So first, when I say unconscious or subconscious, I don't know what that might bring to mind for you. It might bring something like this to mind, a shrink, you know, and this is a pretty good 1960s idea, very Mad Men, or I guess The Sopranos did it too, but it's not really what I'm talking about. And I'm also not talking about this, like your dark subconscious Freudian weirdness that might be lurking in the back corners of your mind. What I'm interested in talking about in the subconscious is the part of our mind where we are unconsciously talking about our preferences for aesthetics. And as creative people, as designers, you all have that, right? You all have an opinion about whether something is good or not. And while I understand that we've all been through design education and we've been taught that there are certain rules to design that make something preferable or not, there's something far deeper that we actually function on a daily basis. So what I want to try to unpeel is, like, what is that? What's the meaning underneath that we're constantly searching for, that we're constantly expressing? And what I hope to show is that the aesthetic choices that you're making are actually strategic choices. And I want to dispel this myth of there's strategy versus creativity. They're really intertwined. They are dependent upon one another. And through this embodied cognition story, maybe you will see that. So what is this kind of bifurcated idea that we used to live in? So you guys have heard of Descartes, Rene Descartes, philosopher from around 16-something, 1640 or so. So he had this big idea in the Age of Enlightenment. It really started the Age of Enlightenment, was part of it, which is that the mind and the body are separate. So if you had to read any philosophy in your life, there's lots of, word after word of how the mind is separate from the body, and the mind makes decisions apart from the body. And it's an interesting idea, and it certainly brought forward an intellectual enlightenment of period when we were in the Dark Ages. But it has some pretty insidious problems with it. And one is that being reasonable and rational is part of the mind, and is a mental decision, part of your brain, and the most important part of yourself. And the body, the intuitive, the visceral side of you, is suspect. And you probably have thought that or heard that, or you felt it in client meetings, right? I mean, you feel like, give me the rational justification of what you're doing. I don't want to know about the emotional aspects of what you're doing. But you've probably also had the experience of when you present work that you really believe in, and you give a compelling argument that probably is more emotional than rational, people believe it as well, right? So we have to struggle with this this dichotomy. And while this idea, I like using the word bifurcation. Do you ever use that word? Sounds really smart. Well, this idea is old, it's like 400 years old. It actually cropped up again in the early 1970s when we really started to dig into hardware and software. And people started to use that analogy of hardware and software as analogs to the human body. And the body became hardware and the mind became software. And again, we started to think about those two things separate. So this has been an idea that's been with us quite a while, but I think the paradigm is shifting, and it's really important that we as designers help shift that paradigm. So I'm going to ask us all to start being more irrational. And probably the first thing you have to do is start recategorizing the word irrational as a bad word, right? Instead of thinking that being irrational is somehow, again, suspect or not really using the best of your intellect, what you really can start to believe is that the rational and the irrational are intimately intertwined and dependent upon one another. How does that sound to you? Does that sound like a crazy idea? Maybe it sounds irrational? All right, so why do I think this and why am I saying this? So this field of study called embodied cognition, it comes out of psychology. And it shows how our rational cues and our irrational cues are interlinked in our experiences. So the easiest way to think about this is, you know that what you think controls your body, right? I'm going to move my arm. But did you also know that what your body does influences how you think? And that's the big idea of embodied cognition, is that the five senses are actually affecting your rational thoughts. All right, so smell, sight, touch, sound. These things are actually having an influence on the way you process information. They actually encounter the world first before your mind starts to encounter it. And depending on certain cues, they might cause your rational mind to lean one way or the other on a certain kind of decision. So let me give you some examples of this. One is tactile sensation. So a study at the University of Amsterdam found that when people were given a task, if they were given a heavy clipboard, they took the task very seriously. And if they were given a light clipboard, they took the task less seriously. And what they realized is that idea of weight, that heaviness, communicated importance to people. And I'll circle back around to that idea again, but just cue in your mind, heavy equals important, all right, or value. Another one, a study at Yale, they put people together to negotiate. They found that people in a cushionless chair had very firm opinions that would not move on those opinions. And people in a chair with a cushion on it were more willing to negotiate. All right, so again, just to give you another metaphor to think about, a soft seat is a soft position. Right? You see how these things are starting to correlate? All right, another Yale study. They found that when people were looking at photos of strangers, if they had a cold glass of water in their hands, their feelings about those strangers were that they were maybe a little more distant, maybe a little harder edged. And when they had a warm mug of liquid, tea or coffee, they thought of them as warmer, more open people. So warmth equals intimacy, warmth equals affection. All right, it goes on though. I gotta give you more than 3 studies. 2 professors, one from Hong Kong and one from Colorado, did a study together. And they found that in the cold weather months, we rent more romance films. Now this is another kind of interesting warmth story, right? You're physically cold, so you're seeking emotional warmth. Here's another one, and this one's probably your parents told you at some point, or a teacher, when they said, just smile, it'll make you happier. It's actually true. So what they found is in another study that when they gave students a test, they had a number of different kinds of questions in them that ranged in emotional state. Some that would cue happiness, some that would be kind of mundane, and then some that would actually be kind of sad. And for a group of the students, some had to put the pencil in their lips like this, and others had to put the pencil in their teeth like this. And they found that the students that had the pencil in their teeth had a heightened sense of happiness on the particular questions of the test that were designed to elicit a joyful response. And what they've done is they've done other tests like this too. That they found that the muscles in your face actually cue these emotional responses you have, and the chemical releases in your brain. So the flip side is you probably remember when Botox was really popular to talk about. There were a number of tests done around people who've had Botox and whether they could be as empathetic, and they found that because they couldn't move their brows, just like, oh, really? Are you okay? Are you? Because they couldn't do that, they had a harder time feeling those emotions. So these are really interesting, aren't they? Because it's just all about our physical interactions with the world and what our muscles are doing and how they're cueing things inside us. I point to my heart. It's not happening here, but this is where we feel it, right? So, first, I think this shows us that we are really irrational and really unconscious in our actions. So, many of you already know this about yourself, and you might even embrace it. All right, and then others of you might think, no, I'm really organized in my thinking. I'm very linear. I'm very analytical. And you're both right. You're both those things, but you're both so much more, right? Because you have both of these things going on. And I think I've seen people that are very analytical. One way to try to maintain that status is to try to stop those emotional feelings from happening, to not affect their thought, right? But that's not necessarily a great thing, because you're cutting off half of your body, right? You're cutting off half of your experience. So there's something really valid to this intuition and these feelings that we have. So for designers, I think this is really actionable. I think this is something we can actually use to make the world better. And metaphor is the clue, all right? So when I first started looking at this, I initially thought, well, it's easy to make up stories. I don't know if this is really important. I don't know if it's important for design. I don't know if it's important to me, but I think I like it. I better talk to people who wrote did the case studies, who performed the clinical studies. And so I reached out to different professors that, I'd read their name in the news article, and then I just emailed them. Like, hey, here's a hunch. How do you feel about this? And one of them I got to talk to is this guy named George Lakoff. He's a Berkeley professor, and he really is what we call the godfather of this concept. Around the early 70s as we started playing with it. He's written lots of books about it. And metaphor was really how he stumbled into it, through language. But nobody has really talked about it in terms of how it affects design. And this is what's been exciting to me about it, and I think it'll be exciting to you about it. The good news is he confirmed the hypothesis we had that these are actionable ideas for designers. Makes a lot of sense. And that's great news, because I think we're on the precipice of being able to create some new kind of discussion around design. So here's another study. A study at the University of Aberdeen found that when people were thinking about the future, they would lean forward, and when they were thinking about the past, they would lean backward. And this is an interesting mental model, right? We think about time, generally in this way. The future is ahead of me, or up. The past is behind me. Now, if you think about how you could use that as a design tool, if you were working on a project or a brand that needs to communicate this idea that it's advanced or it's progressive, would you do something that caused people's body to lean in or lean back? You want them to lean in, right? Because we actually know that's part of the cue of how we understand progression. So think about the Genius Bar at Apple. There's actually something really nice about a bar like that, where you can lean in, where both people can lean in this sense instead of reclining, because it's active and it's actually helping cue a lot of those ideas that Apple wants you to have. Is that we're on the forefront, we're advanced. So when you think about this idea of advance, you can think about orientation, posture, stance, and maybe that's a design cue you would use to make your design stronger. And here's a graphic example. It's a visual onomatopoeia, right? The progressive logo is leaning forward, and it is what it says it is. I think that's pretty cool. And you guys already thought of that as like active and dynamic and future forward, right? You all felt that already. You just didn't know if there was some kind of scientific explanation for it. Isn't that cool? I mean, all these things you've known for your whole life as a creative person, you're learning that they're actually valid. All right, another one, feminine and soft. This is I think a kind of controversial one, but I think it's been proven over time. And so there was three professors from different parts of the world. I don't know why professors use this, but a guy from Tufts, a guy from Denver, and a guy from Toronto. I don't know how they even got together. But again, one of the studies of we're going to show you pictures of strangers. And what they did for these is they showed photos of people that were androgynous. You couldn't really tell because of their haircut that whether they were male or female. And they gave them two different materials. They gave one group a soft ball to squeeze and another group a hard ball to squeeze. And overwhelmingly, the group that had the soft ball identified more of those photos as women, and the group that had the hard ball identified more of those photos as men. So that's interesting, right? This idea that feminine could be soft, and that maybe there's something there you could use in your design. And I think the method did something very interesting in this teardrop. I don't think anyone would look at that and call that a masculine form, right? That there's something about that does feel feminine and attractive. So that's a design cue. And I'm sure you've talked about your designs in this way before. So maybe that's a material choice, or maybe that's a formal choice. So, you probably have a name for all of this, right? But you didn't know it was grounded in science, because I'm sure you've done designs, and you've gone back to your client, and you've given them some great stories about why that design makes sense. And maybe you post-rationalized it, right? Or maybe the majority of the time you post-rationalize it. And I'm here to tell you that's probably okay, all right? Because it probably isn't made up. I mean, it probably is real, but you just haven't had the tools or the equipment to really ground it in anything effective and strong that would be persuasive, right? Now, really, I think August designers that are really persuasive don't need anything else, because you believe in them and you believe in what they're saying and you just go with it, right? And if you're good at that, just do that, right? You don't need to worry about any of this. Just keep getting good at being persuasive and building confidence and helping sell your designs in that way. But that doesn't always work. Even the best designers, even the biggest firms struggle. And there was a great story that Michael Beirut put on Design Observer in January. It was after the American Airlines logo came out. And it was something, I think it was called Graphic Design as a Spectator Sport. And he goes ahead and makes a confession that Pentagram tried for 3 years to redesign the UPS logo, and they could not convince the client that their designs were the ones to choose. Another firm came in and did it in less than a year. And he said it was all about persuasion. It wasn't about the quality of the work. And he just brought that up as a point that when we're all critiquing these new identity designs across the internet, but it's so much more complicated than the formal choices that have been made. That's a little side note. But the point there really is that even the best of us sometimes need some kind of something behind us to really help convince the client that what we're saying is true. So here's an example from IDEO. A couple of years, we work with Sealy, the mattress company. And by the way, I love working on really boring, mundane things. They're the most fun things to work on. And mattresses, my gosh, they're ironic. They're not sexy, and they should be, right? So we work with Sealy, And they hired us to redesign one of their flagship brands and the products in that brand line. And when we saw this is pretty standard. We knew there was a lot of problems to making that attractive because the brand is promising to be healthy, it's promising to be advanced, it's Posturepedic, and which was an interesting brand. It came out in the 1950s. Like everybody else, got doctors to endorse it. And cigarette companies are getting doctors to endorse things too. But interesting anyway. They were trying to use expertise. And but what we saw is a need in the design to start changing the manufacturing equipment to get certain types of new corners, new edges, new tensions in the bed. Because without being able to change the form like that, which right now is just like a big rectangle, we knew we couldn't communicate those values. So that's an important request because it has cost implications, right? When you ask anybody to say, hey, capital investment, just throw down a few more $100,000 or even a few million and your design will look great. It's kind of like, all right, intelligent designer, you have the constraints. Just follow the rules, all right? But we knew from the consumer side it wouldn't be effective. So we struggled with them and we came back and we showed them this. And we asked them, which apple would you like to eat? Right or left? Which one do you guys want to eat?
Left. You're right or wrong?
Yeah, well, most people say this one, right? If you grew up like in a really efficient household, you might have chosen that one because you feel responsible and you need to be told first. But most people choose that, right? And the reason is because one's healthy and one's withering and kind of dying, right? And we use that as a way to explain why the corners of the beds needed to be taut and plump and rich and fresh. And that allowed us to change the form factor of the bed to do that, right? So we're literally able to change from having to have a ruffled corner around the edges of this thing to be able to start showing certain areas of freshness and health in the design. Now, when we did this, we didn't even know about this concept of embodied cognition, right? We were just using elements from the world around us to experience, but we knew it was valid, right? And so, thank God we read a report and we're okay. And there's all kinds of things around you like this. Like I think about puddles. It just rained yesterday, last couple days, sunny today finally. There's lots of nice little reflective surfaces around on the ground right now, and those are really interesting. They're attractive. You notice them just like a mirage. You notice that and you go after it. It's a cue. It says hydration. It's shiny. You want to pursue it. It's like a mirror, and it's standing out in a muted landscape. That's an interesting concept, right? It's a signal of some kind, something you can use as a designer. Right? Think about it here. These two rings signal different things. So think about the cultural aspect. The cultural aspect comes second to the actual physical aspect. But the perception between the two is very different, right? One's shiny and it's bling, right? And it's an interesting thing that bling is kind of programmed into human DNA. One reflects light, one draws your attention, and apply it to something like this, right? I mean, it's something attractive and desirable, and you want to go toward it. It's on your desk. It's something actually interesting that you want to move toward and touch. And if it was like the river stone in that ring, it'd be different, right? You wouldn't feel the same about it. And remember when computers were kind of bleh, like they're beige? Yeah, I mean, that was kind of, I think we figured that out, intuitively. So, last couple slides, what can you do with this? What can you start today? I've only shared with you a tip of the iceberg, right? There's just there's so much more to know. Every day I get a new Google alert on embodied cognition. So set one up if you want to start reading about this stuff. Here's the first thing I can suggest to you. Begin with something you probably already do. So you describe your designs already with all kinds of these metaphors, but you didn't really know that they were connected to something, right? So I like all of these. You probably use them all. Clean, that layout's clean, or that feels really dark, or wow, that's quiet. Could you make it a little bit louder? Wow, this feels really anchored, or that's really dynamic. All of those are ways we describe what we make, right? What I would encourage you to do is go back and start looking in these studies to see if there are equivalents. So I talked about weight, right? Heaviness. You feel something that feels heavy. Well, you may or may not remember, there used to be a debate about the whether or not Japanese cars or American cars had better quality. And a lot of that conversation went down to the weight of the doors. Remember this? That was a cultural debate. Because the doors were, the manufacturing was equal, but the weight felt different, people thought it was cheap. So that's a really interesting one that you can see happen over and over in culture. So try some of these out today. You know, I just made a list randomly on the plane yesterday. You've got all these words you use all the time to describe ideas and describe designs. So how can you start equating them to these studies that are going on? The other thing is a little different, and I think we are what many of us call the post-disciplinary age of design, right? So you're trained in one discipline, but there are all kinds of demands upon you as a designer now that require you to work outside of that discipline. And almost all of us are trained in a formal discipline, right? We learn to manipulate aesthetics, we learn to manipulate objects. And I think this idea, this concept of metaphor, is a key to becoming post-disciplinary. It's really a way to go from tangible to non-tangible. And the way I think about it is this: as a craftsman, you start to really understand how to manipulate the world. You can articulate that, and you can mold it to your liking. All right, and if you start to apply that concept to experience, you can then begin to design better and new experiences. So, for example, you know that a sharp edge on an object makes it less difficult, makes it harder to hold, right? This is a very rounded, right? So when we use phrases like, hey, take the edge off that, right? And we say, or have a drink, take the edge off, right? That's really an interesting cue to start thinking about experience design, right? We can start to design with these metaphors that we've been using to describe physical objects, or even our own experience, into new experiences for people. So try that out for yourself. You know, if you're a discipline, whatever you are, a graphic designer, an industrial designer, even an interactive designer, you're using a lot of the same phrases all the time that we as a broad design discipline use. And that can be an effective way for you to start moving post-disciplinary, not to move out of your discipline, but actually to be able to communicate with other designers in a clearer way, and also to start to have confidence in having that conversation in the first place. So, I think you should be paying attention to psychology if you don't already. I mean, we've been taught to look at anthropology for signs and symbols, but there's a lot of richness here that really, I think, has profound impact on design. And so try to be, your new pursuit, be an amateur neuropsychologist. And in Cambridge, that sounds really normal. So I'm just going to blink an eye. And then finally, if you did take this presentation seriously, just realize that I used a heavy font throughout. Thanks.
So we'll do some questions?
Yeah.
Do you think there's an evolutionary reason that explains why the human brain operates in this way? Like, so that's how the human brain operates, but why? How did it end up that way?
Yeah, so that's the evolutionary question, especially evolutionary psychology. I wondered for quite a while whether it was related or not. And the challenge of evolutionary psychology right now, especially in this realm, is it starts to boil everything down to survival and the continuation of the species, right? And I think for explaining beauty and aesthetics and art, it starts to break down as a theory, as a philosophy. And there's actually a lot of debate right now. There was I think it was in the Atlantic, a really long critique of a couple new evolutionary psychology books that came out that are in, they're trying to create a theory of aesthetics through evolutionary psychology. But there's a lot about it yet that doesn't explain the joy and the compulsion to create, right? And so I don't know. I've been trying to figure out where the two come together, and because that field itself is really volatile on opinion. I have no idea. I haven't found anybody that feels really strongly about it. People studying language and people studying behavior from a different lens seem, to me right now, seem to have a better hold on why we might do the things we do, rather than boiling it down to what feels like an oversimplistic conversation. Yes?
So a lot of the things that you talked about are things that either evolutionary or whatever naturally are things that we have associations of those might be cultural, feminine, soft, masculine, hard. What role do you think designers play in pushing some of those? Like, should we think that feminine is soft? Like, and what role as a designer do you think about and maybe an impact? Or you just exploit it because the client like it?
That's a complicated question. I mean, I think, I believe we all have a moral obligation to do what's right and to not perpetuate stereotypes. And we want to advance people's thinking, perceptions forward. So I wouldn't encourage anyone to do something manipulative, especially if it fell into some kind of cultural. I mean, at the same time, I think we have to recognize that there's a shared human experience that is valuable for us to tap into and that we can use to make things better. So I think on that side of the argument, then I would just say it's up to each person's moral judgment to do the right thing there. But it's not I'll use the word bifurcating. No, it's not an either or. I think it's a complex, I guess, per instance decision. Any questions?
So, some of these things seem like interesting truisms that, I mean, no edge, a rounded edge would appeal to people around the world. And I know that IDEO does a lot of projects around the world. So, how do you deal with the challenges of things that might not have the same reaction? Maybe heavy in Japan doesn't have the same validity that it does in the United States.
Yeah, so I think one thing we're trying to figure out is how geography and culture play into this. And what we're trying to do is find the elements that are not affected by culture or geography, that are really just human experience. So this is where language metaphor really matters culturally, right? So, for example, I just had this conversation with somebody in our studio, Ken Suzuki, he's from Japan. We're inviting one of our past colleagues, Minato Fukusawa, back to IDEO to do a workshop with us. And we're going to do the workshop on embodiment. And the reason we chose that is because we wanted to explore the very idea you're asking about. In the Japanese language, do we have similar metaphors? Because we're going to look at the similarities and try to find where those common experiences exist. And then we'll start to look at the differences and see if we understand. But I think there will be no universal silver bullet, but there will definitely be broad acceptance of many things, and then you'll have a lot of outlying perceptions around the world as well.
Any others? All right.
All right, thank you very much.
So thank you all for waking up early and sharing that awesome presentation with us. And thanks again to Michael.